You're listening to the Juddy Show, powered by Agricom and a small AA battery.
I'm Alistair Moorhead, Portfolio Manager and Senior Agronomist.
And I'm Glenn Judson, Animal Nutritionist and Farm Systems Specialist. We're here to help explain the technical, practical, and sometimes humorous implications of forages and animal systems. It's technical, made simple. G'day there, Alistair. How you doing today?
Good, thanks, Juddy.
You're looking pretty good in shorts, I must say.
Oh, yeah. It's still only late winter.
Excellent. Now, we've got a visitor in studio today. Very excited about this.
Yeah, it's a great privilege to have Dr. Alan Stewart with us. Alan, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Alan, when I first started work, Alan was my absolute senior mentor and a major influence on the start of my career. So it's an absolute privilege to be here with you today. And we're going to go for a bit of a journey, Juddy. We're going to have a look at his career through the decades.
Wow.
Yeah.
That will be an interesting journey.
Well, it will be, and it is really. It's and it's really important, actually, Alan, to capture this because, as I say, as we move further and further away from some really large innovations and identifications through those years, it's nice to have it recorded and
Absolutely.
have it and things.
So let's, before we get going, because as we always do on the Elliot and Juddy Show, we ask the tough questions first, which is getting to know our guest. And Alan, what was your first car?
Well, I had a motorbike first.
Right. So what was your motorbike?
I was a Honda 125, and that went all around New Zealand for 5 years or more while I was at university.
Oh, wow.
Wow. Well, let's
Speaks more about the traffic loading on the roads in New Zealand back in the day.
I managed to go from Christchurch over to Greymouth for Invercargill for $1 on petrol.
Oh, wow.
Oh, my goodness. Just for listeners, I think that would be very close to 1,500 kilometres.
So actually, where do you come from, Alan?
Well, I grew up in Barrytown on the west coast.
Well, you missed it.
Oh,
Was that big, is it? That's that big. That is that big.
And so I guess the next question, so from a genealogy point of view,
All my ancestors came out here in the gold rush.
Right.
And that was Scotland and Northern Ireland, England and Cornwall, really. So it's blame the gold rush for them all coming here.
Yeah.
They all wanted a better life.
Yeah. And did you settle quite early on the West Coast?
They were all on the West Coast before the 1870s.
Oh, wow.
And, one great-grandfather had a brewery and another one had a pub.
Yeah. And unless I'm mistaken, you've written a book about that.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
I've actually got, I think, the only signed copy of their book.
Being a beer man yourself, a brewer yourself, how could I know that?
Worked out probably more profitable than long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Alistair, let's take us through the way we're going to sort of have the next 50 minutes. How are we going to run this?
From a forage setting and from a private industry setting, Alan would be one of the most influential plant breeders in New Zealand's history. So I think the only way to really start is to start through your education phase and what was just unfolding at the end of the 70s. So, Alan, where did you, when you finally got across the Southern Alps to the East Coast, where did you go and what did you do?
Well, I actually went to University of Canterbury for 1 year. I was going to do electrical engineering, but I hadn't done applied maths. So I thought I'd swap over to Lincoln. So I finished my Bachelor of Agricultural Science there. Then I did a Master's on clovers.
Yeah.
And then
We have that in common.
Before I finally got my job and did my PhD part-time.
Yeah. And you got your job in what year?
I got my job in 1979 after I finished my Master's. And really, when you look back at that whole period, Plant Breeders' Rights Law was enacted in 1973 in New Zealand, and that opened the door for private companies to employ plant breeders. Prior to that, all the breeding had been done in the government DSIR or
so now we're talking
department.
73 legislation changed. I'm correct to say, so our heritage, all three of us, our heritage starts with the PGG business, and the first research farm was established
around 73.
Around 73. So the implication of plant variety rights occurring was that it gave incentive to private industry to invest.
Yes, and I was among the first of the plant breeders employed as a result of that law. There was plenty of evaluation prior to that, but the plant breeding really only just started with our employment. And to be fair, we didn't know how to do it very well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is the point, is that people when you look at the thriving industries that we have today, it was just such a small world back then, wasn't it?
It was small. We were untrained in many ways. We hadn't seen many examples. The only examples we could see were in the government breeding system in DSIR, who were very, very thorough. Quite a different process from what we ended up doing.
Yeah, because you ended up being less resource because you weren't people resource like the government at that time had research stations all around the country. They had multiple breeding locations, the ability to reach quite wide and far, really. And to be fair, even 2 decades later when I turned up, we're still very nimble business, getting a lot from a little.
And of course, PGG in those days is just a regional company, so we weren't even in the North Island. So the focus really was very much on Canterbury, which of course is the hub of seed production, but it wasn't the sales territory really.
And still background to that, still being a trading seed company at that stage as well.
Yeah, absolutely, commodity trading.
And when you started, did you start on lots of species, or was it just a few, or what was your strategy?
I was actually employed. Dr. Lionel Corkle, who had been the director of Grasslands, had retired at that stage, and he was taken on as a sort of an advisor by John Patterson, and his great desire was to actually develop a late flowering ryegrass. So one thing he regretted, or that he had never developed, was a late flowering ryegrass, as well as some tetraploids that he wished to develop.
Yeah.
And so the first project was actually evaluating late flowering ryegrass, and based on European material, and most of that was not very highly performing. And of course, being late flowering,
winter dormant,
it got a lot of stem rust. So the focus was on stem rust, really.
Yeah,
and we succeeded on that project, but there was various other factors came to overtake it with endophyte and things, and it never became.
And that's for me a crucial timeline comment just then, is that you had a couple of interactions with the endophyte discovery and moment of time, because one of your studies was on the role of annual or Italian ryegrass endophyte.
Well, no, that was really after the endophyte discoveries in the early 80s. I was had a lot of experiments, and we were starting to measure endophyte and begin to understand what's happening in annual ryegrass, and of course in perennial ryegrass and in turf ryegrass, where endophyte wasn't available either.
Yeah, due to storage over time, the turf industry was really not exposed.
The turf industry, of course, when I started, was using pasture ryegrass mixed with white clover for sports fields. So it was a pretty primitive world.
Yeah. So from that perspective, that endophyte discovery, when did it really kick off?
Around 81, 82, 83 is a real start of that. And then I enrolled in my PhD in 83 part-time, and I did that as part of my breeding work at Ceres.
Yeah.
And finally finished that in 87.
Oh, wow. And that topic was?
Endophytic aspects of plant breeding. Yeah. But the very first experiment was actually following up from Steve Goldson's experiment, where he found that stem weevil resistance was caused by ryegrass under some conditions. That he had done that pre-endophyte, and we were able to show in the very first experiment that, of course, it was endophyte.
Yeah, and this is a big deal because for the listeners, the endophyte is very central to the success of ryegrass plants in New Zealand. However, it really wasn't identified until this moment, and this is the significance of what we're talking about and its discovery in that early phase, at late 70s, early 80s. And I think that can't go without being stated, because so many of our farm strategies, which were getting a little bit influenced by subsidies at that time as well because of stocking rates being elevated, New Zealand had a summer ill thrift issue across our country, which we identified as summer ill thrift. And this occurred with a terrible performance, almost to the point of negative live weight gains on lambs through summertime. We're a big sheep country at that stage. And so we have real massive issues with livestock performance through summer throughout the eastern side of New Zealand. And so that was never identified as anything other than a summer ill thrift. And so no one understood that it was actually wild type endophytes having an effect on these animals at that time. And insects, yeah. And a lot of feeding strategies were implemented all through those decades. Using summer brassica is not a recent thing. It's been around for many, many years. And the predominant reason for summer brassica was actually to create safe environments for summer ill thrift, which is ironic how wheels turn, and we think we're discovering new stuff today, which they've been doing for unknown reasons for literally decades. So we're in the 2000s now, 1990s now, but there's a couple of real components that sit within inside your career there, because the 90s represent a Mark I breeding phase where you're creating your first products. And how are you going about that from a perspective?
I'll just come back a little bit. As you said earlier, there were subsidies in the 80s. 87 was a crash, and that was a major restructure of agriculture in New Zealand. Farmers had very low commodity prices, no subsidies. The labourer was put off. The wife often went out to work. The manager, was often even working part-time as well. It was a terrible time, and there was a lot of farms went under. So in our company, that influenced our company. And in fact, I probably only kept my employment because I did an overseas consultancy at that stage in India, which earned the company enough to effectively pay my salary for those years.
I think that's really relevant because we don't relate to these things today, but I keep coming back to the world was such a smaller place, and it was nowhere near the productive nature that we see our country in today. And so much of this is put down to intensification and systems changes. So, we must understand the roots of our country.
It took many years for the company to recover from that. And in fact, our breeding programs were pretty small. Yeah. But we were beginning to be more focused on better commercial products rather than just some of the early ones were ecotype selections. And we started doing a lot more crosses. We started incorporating endophyte at the right level in there, and of course a lot of that was also wild type endophyte. Yeah. And because we didn't have novel endophytes initially,
so this is still the 90s.
Yes, yeah. We looked at alternative species. So there was an increase in the use of coxfit, safe species. Coxfit, we looked at I looked at bromes, and that resulted in effectively a fine dense prairie grass, which was grazing brome.
Yeah, okay.
It had a very small role for a number of years until we discovered, or Ag Research discovered, the novel endophytes. Yeah. And that really changed things, because then you could use ryegrass.
Yeah, much of its country went into grapes in the end of the day. But from that perspective, that created the start, really, though, of the development of those. Just out of interest, ecotype breeding. So the 80s, it was still a primary style of breeding.
It was still possible to go and collect endophytes that were productive.
Yeah.
And of course,
grasses in the field.
Grasses out of the field or from overseas, you could find them in gene banks. And within 10 years or so, it became very apparent that you had to cross various sources together to actually achieve even better yields. And today, it's very rare to go and collect a ecotype that is productive enough to be used. Now, it can be used in crosses, but there's a variety.
A bit of the legacy of dealing with some of the material as part of my early career in the mid-90s was that the one thing about ecotype breeding is that really the association with plant toxicity was only just truly being acknowledged at the end of the 80s, is that those highly successful plants on East Coast dryland farms were also the most toxic, and that's why they're being left by animals. So it was definitely the end of an era of ecotype breeding when we understood that the things that were likely to be left were likely to be the most toxic, and therefore that really made it not a value proposition that we really...
That's right, particularly with the wild.
Yeah, which rolls us pretty much into the 90s. And so, the 90s were a pretty big year for you, really.
There was a lot of varieties came through. That was when our first varieties really started coming through. We'd been breeding for 10, 15 years, which is the time it takes to develop. So the very first phase of varieties came through. Remember, what we were trying to do was develop a portfolio of varieties that the company owned. So took many, many years to get a portfolio that was valuable. And even after 25 years, we were only really just cracking it at that stage.
Juddy, I keep saying this, is that, one of the disjoints with all the world when it comes to pastoral stuff and farming is our industries are long-term, not short-term. No matter which way we look at these discussions, this is not a fast industry. Things happen slowly. Farmers could be expected by, society to change fast and that, but we just can't change anything fast because it takes a long, long time to achieve.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is 10 years is a short time in farming, and particularly in developing new cultivars,
Yes.
And also developing new species. And I guess the other thing we can come back to is the 90s represented the development of a brand new species, one that I spent a long time dealing with, and that was plantain.
Yeah, well, plantain was a absolutely fascinating species for me. I was able to get germplasm that was surprisingly productive on the very first time we got germplasm. We got a very, very interesting set of germplasm, which we were able to develop into tonic. And that was quite an amazing story because we had to learn how herbs fitted into pasture systems and all the issues that go with that.
Yeah, so that was, when did that hit? When did you first
early
start
90s,
looking
early
at the-
90s, we obtained the germplasm, and it took a few years to actually develop that into a cultivar. And so I think the publication was 96 when we had it at the Grasslands Association.
It was, and I was a student through that phase, and I reckon I saw the first space plants at the Ag Research Boundary Road site on one of my study tours in probably 93, 94. And I was just a student at that time, and therefore, and it was a big breakthrough moment because we were just coming out of the late 80s and very early 90s. We were going through a diverse pasture phase of medicinal paddocks, medicinal pastures, and we had all sorts of stuff in here, really reminiscent of a little bit of the cycle we've just been, we're experiencing at the moment. And one of the big issues of all that work categorically was that we're a temperate environment that values winter activity. The valuing of winter activity was only just starting to really kick off in the 90s in real terms. And the bigger point of all is that there is virtually no other species other than the ryegrass that is really valuable in cool season activity. And here I was out as a student, and I had an absolute awareness of what it meant to see a herb standing 12 inches high in the middle of a Canterbury winter, where I was still wearing shorts at that time too. Thanks, Juddy. And as were you. And this was like 12 inches high, and it was the middle of winter, and all other species that farmers could use of any other type.
Any other perennial
type was dead winter dormant. And, even as a student, I understood what that meant. It actually meant that suddenly you could actually have it in a diet in a calendar year. And that's when I was a student, and who knew I was going to start working with it later.
I wonder whether to think about this, and we're going to get to the present day shortly, but I wonder whether if are we going to see something like that again?
As a wee divergent.
Because I think it looked like we were breeding our traditional species being ryegrass and clover and maybe a few other grasses because of the endophyte issue. But this looked like this was really from left field, and I guess and this is probably a question for you, Alan. I guess that came from the fact that you were given that freedom to go and search the world for forages that might be useful.
Yeah, it's a very difficult one. The interesting thing about plantain, of course, is it's so widespread in so many environments, so broadly adapted. The seed production is relatively easy compared to something like a dandelion.
Most importantly, worldwide, it's a prostrate, flat-leafed, winter dormant weed species.
In the lawn environments that we know, but on the hay pasture environments, it can be an erect species.
Yeah, so through the season,
yeah.
But I guess I wonder whether in today's modern, focused, very systemized breeding programs, whether you'd be allowed to have such sort of extravagant thought.
Well, I think there's plenty of breeders that have small breeding programs on the side,
Right.
even though they're doing very, very thorough systemised breeding. Many breeders have small programs where they're exploring things, and you have to do that as a breeder. You have to do it in the species you're working with as well as...
And Juddy, I think in answering your question, the reality is you play part of that role as well now. So back in the day, there was not a you. You know, this was a world which was very, very small at this moment. There was really only Alan and probably our colleague Murray Kelly. And relatively speaking, the structure around them was very small. So now you think about a future where every 5 to 8 years, there's different aims and objectives emerging. There's proprietary meats and other things being created by feedstuffs. I think what you might find is when you're looking at species and or development of the future, it may actually not be plant breeder led. It may very well be directed from, let's just say, the types of animal interaction work that you do.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm sure there'll be plenty of herbs out there that are capable of altering flavours and things that we haven't thought of so much
Environmental
today.
states, methane production, things that
we
were
haven't
on the table
explored
back then.
those yet.
Yeah. No, so actually the big other little milestone in the 90s very much was I turned up, which actually changed your world though, didn't it? Because the reality is it meant that you didn't have to go and do all the evaluation. You didn't have to do the farm consulting. You didn't have to do...
I didn't have to visit seed crops.
Yeah.
I was involved in nearly every aspect, which did give me a grounding for today.
Which is quite unique at the time.
And today's breeders will largely be working in one species. They won't be involved in assisting with the marketing. They won't be involved in the seed production. So there's a lot of
all the extension to farm. And that's actually, the scaling up by taking someone like myself on in the early mid-90s doesn't sound a lot, but it is when you realise that Alan was doing everything along with a couple of other colleagues.
It enabled us to do a lot more in the north of New Zealand in programs, and particularly in perennial, which resulted in 150 perennial ryegrass.
Yeah, which is very much the start of the 2000s in that space. I think the other thing that you and I both were kicking off big time at that stage is as a company we moved into Australia.
Yes.
And in the middle of the 2000s. Now, that happened before I started, but by 1998, I'd started traveling over there quite a lot in support of the evaluation and the brand development.
And at the same time, there was a collapse in the plant breeding in Australia within the state sector, a very big focus on biotechnology.
So that sucked a lot of money out of the practical part of the state system.
Yeah, and today there's no state funding in plant breeding, although there is money in biotechnology, but it's disconnected. Yeah. So
that hadn't fully happened in New Zealand at that stage.
No, it hadn't. No, New Zealand's very different. We continued on with state breeding until really 2016, when the government lost their plant breeders, and focused more today on pre-breeding and on the molecular breeding and germplasm.
Okay, and so from that point we do hit the 2000s, Juddy.
Yeah,
which is a big decade for you.
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
but at the start of the decade, we actually had a major component occur at the start of the decade. The novel endophytes had been discovered.
Yes.
At the end of the 80s, wasn't it?
Well, through the 90s.
Yeah, and then a couple of first up with endosafes and things like that got released in the...
and then AR1.
Yeah, and AR1 was released in 2000, I think.
And then eventually in the mid-2000s, AR37.
Yeah, and that was a pretty big milestone for us as a company and also a breeding house.
It completely changed the persistence of those grasses in the North Half.
Or even the balance between animal performance and persistence.
The gain in insect resistance is incredible.
Yeah.
And I remember at that time, I was actually working in deer systems, and AR1 was seen as because deer respond probably significantly to the wild type, that was seen as a real breakthrough. And I can remember there was a lot of excitement, certainly through the deer industry, of these novel endophytes that were potentially going to improve on farm productivity, both forage but also animals. And I guess the other thing that was really interesting at that time was there was a lot of focus on per head performance, so that we after those the autumn ill thrift, there was a real focus, particularly with the AR1 and adding clover to mixes and stuff, is to try and get the speed at which single animals grew pretty quickly. And then that actually changed, but we'll talk a little bit of that when we get to the right decade of that changing. But there was a real focus.
So that is exactly right. You go back, I think a lot of people have always thought, for example, perenniality has been the number one point. I think there's a classic paper from a gentleman called Tom Fraser based out of Oamaru after a series of droughts, and literally perenniality was, I think, third on the list of that paper. It was animal health and animal per head performance were first and second, and actually perenniality was actually third. So it depends on the commodity drivers of the moment to where perenniality sits in those discussions. And it was quite obvious that coming out of the animal ill thrift era, animal health and per head performance was a major topic. It was really important to acknowledge that at the start of the 2000s, we were still struggling to get plantain on the map.
Yes.
Part of my day job was literally convincing all of the New Zealand farming community that it wasn't a flatweed and that it was a useful species. And so
in fact, you had more success in Australia in the dairy industry initially than in New Zealand.
100%. I still smile and remember back to a period of time where we were selling more seed into Northland with plantain in the late 90s and early 80s than we do now, literally, in the tons. So it's so interesting that, we're still entering discussions every now and then, but when people think these things are novel, and I look at our legacy with this and I think, oh my goodness, we've been here doing this for a very long time now. 2000s kicked off, you described the starting of the Northwest Spain influence on New Zealand plant genetics.
Well, certainly in my program, it had influenced before that within others.
Yes.
But we were also moving in the 2000s towards a brassica portfolio.
Yes, we were.
So that was surprisingly successful very quickly.
Yep.
We were able to develop that.
Yeah, no, that was right. And all through the 90s, you were developing that and we were releasing that literally on the change of the decade. So some pretty cool products came out then. There's some very, very big brands that some people in New Zealand may recognise with Sovereign Kale and actually Hunter Leaf Turnip. Actually, we still have a bit of that around today, doing pretty well. So they were very, very popular and really good products at that time.
Just going back to the use of Northwest Spain genetics, can you just unpack that a little bit? What's so unique about that set of genetics?
Well, I think the main thing is that when New Zealand was settled by people from England with their species, which were really a little bit too winter dormant for the New Zealand environment. And also they were early flowering. When you collect material in Northwest Spain, it's a warmer winter, it's almost frost-free, and surprisingly, it was late flowering germplasm. So that germplasm really opened a door for us, and it's probably due to natural integration from the Italian ryegrass world. There's a little bit of that in there, so we do find orms in that material. But that has been probably the closest climate to particularly the North Island, the interactive environments, is Northwest Spain. That's a site, that's a province which is reasonable rainfall, but still droughts that match New Zealand.
And I think the relevance of that is not worth understating, is that at that moment, virtually all our grasslands across all of New Zealand went to seed in the middle of October, or the middle of spring. And in a window that could probably be covered in about 10 days, which basically meant all the way through the 90s, all the way through the development of dairy in the early 2000s, we were dealing with spring pasture management discussions constantly because everything was going to seed in the middle of spring. And so you got two big issues. We developed and you created the first of the winter-active late flowering genetics. Relatively speaking, late flowering is common in the world, but it's connected to winter dormancy. So that was a big breakthrough from an industry perspective. But the bigger part is that we literally improved spring pasture quality by giving us between 2 and 3 weeks worth of vegetative growth without reproductive development.
And in the other species, in Italian ryegrass, we also improved the persistence of Italian ryegrass and the hybrids. So the winter activity of perennials was increasing, becoming more like Italian, and Italian was becoming more persistent. So we brought them much closer together, and the use of endophytes and the Italians and hybrids have been.
Yeah, I remember vividly being out with you selecting, in this case it was Asset, and it was literally selected from very productive second winter plants.
That's right.
And
with no seed heads on it.
With no seed heads on it. And so, it was quite a classical, after having a very, very successful product in the form of Crusader Italian ryegrass, which many people in Australia will recognise very, very clearly. Asset was this more resilient, long-lived Italian style plant, which was really quite attractive at the time. And then we were the first to add endophyte to that type of genetics, which was a really important improvement for particularly the dairy industry, where you're putting an Italian in to stressful summer dry environments with quite a lot of insects, and you've got this 2-winter opportunity.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, if you just look at the development of forages over time, and you're saying, are we making progress? Sometimes it would be, understanding this, that we've pushed back flowering dates, we've got endophytes coming on, we've made things a bit more perennial. Often, if we look at the development saying we're doing that solely on yield,
it's very flawed.
You really miss some of the big changes that have happened that have made it far more useful for the farming system. Correct. So yield's probably a very blunt instrument, or a blunt way of evaluating when you look at all of the different things that plant breeders have brought to us.
Well, when I started, there was a very limited range of cultivars and heading dates, and you compare that today, we have a full range of heading dates across many of the species. We have tetraploids with their increased palatability. We have endophyte and reliably in the cultivars to give us the insect resistance. So the opportunities for developing farm systems today are so much more amazing than in the early period when I started, where you only had one heading date and two ryegrass cultivars.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another big thing happened in the 2000s. And it was really a big thing for all of us, wasn't it? Is that it was very much the era of mergers and consolidation.
Absolutely. And that was a wee bit of a shock for everybody in the company, because we were looking forward to competing with Wrightsons. But in the end, we were working with Wrightsons, which was also a real pleasure. So
absolutely. And to be fair, people like yourself and myself thrived in that moment, because we had access to everything. Three big engines coming together between Ag Research, the Wrightsons seed business, and PGG. We brought 3 programs together. Yes. And it would have changed your world dramatically. And certainly changed mine.
And we had access to the safe endophytes, which we didn't have prior to that.
From the PGG perspective,
That was quite exciting.
What role did you take on in that early stage too, by the way? Because that was still a merger of a lot of people and programs. It was...
Well, I was chief scientist for the group, really.
At that stage.
But my plant breeding work continued with a team of other plant breeders working alongside me. So, but it took us ages. Those 3 groups of plant breeders were still very competitive people, and they competed with each other for quite a while. It took us a while to benchmark all the material together to finally figure out where the good germplasm sat, and there was good germplasm from all those breeders. And we were able to develop effectively a single program out of that. But it was a process, a 10-year process getting there.
Yeah, again, coming back to the time frame it takes to merge groups of businesses with programs that are like 10 years steep and different origins too. Yep. So again, the regimented way we deal with endophyte was different between all 3 programs. And so even bringing the practices of incorporating genetics was quite often limited by their behaviour with monitoring and maintaining endophyte.
And it wasn't easy with AR37 endophyte either, because it didn't necessarily work in all the germplasm, and it certainly didn't work unless you had absolute thorough quality control through all the breeding process, the maintenance process, and the delivery of the commercial seed,
which
was quite a challenge.
Yeah, and that was the bedding down of the end of the 2000s, was starting to bed down those sort of processes, wasn't it? Now, it was a very interesting time for us all.
Well, the other thing that happened I think at the end of the 2000s was our the sale of PG rights to the Chinese.
Yes.
So that changed our ownership again.
And that leads on to quite a bit of your career in the 210s, because what you were pretty much thrown at our new owners at that time.
Well, I spent quite a bit of time and a number of trips to China, understanding what the research world in China looked like, just as other people were looking at the commercial world and working with our owners. So I got to know the landscape in China reasonably well. And it's only this year that I've actually got back after about a 10-year break to actually meet those scientists and understand the new landscape in China. And it's developed a lot, but it's not a region of the world with great seed production and forages.
No, that's right. A very continental country.
Yeah, it's not the seed production is still a lot of imported seed to China.
Yeah, which is potentially always the opportunity and the reason for being in the neighbourhood.
Yeah.
And so, rolling into the 210s, new ownership, we're just starting to get other vibes kicking out of the landscape. The topic of environment was starting to get aired at the start of the 2010s. We were looking at different things. From our perspective, we started to learn new things about plantain at that time.
That's right.
Which I think is when you consider the journey we've been on, it's quite fascinating that it's the same thing you've been dealing with the whole time. And next thing you are looking at a whole different topic associated with plantain.
Yeah, looking at different.
And that's the emergence of the ecotane discoveries.
Yeah, looking through the different lens. And I think what actually helped in some of those discoveries was that we'd had a lot of history with plantain over multiple years and looked at seed crops and could start to interpret some of the stuff that we were
cropping phases.
seeing.
Yeah,
I think the other thing that and we're getting into the 210s now, and one of the things is that focus started shifting from this per head performance now to what are we doing per hectare. I mean, how can we drive the efficiency of farm systems? So we'd gone from treating sort of animals as individuals now to moving to these farm systems where could we actually design forage systems that better mimic what provided forage at a time where animals would respond to the most.
Oh, and a whole discussion that was continuing to merge through the 2000s, but the whole per hectare discussion, whereas we can maximize or optimize per head production. We've already almost locked and loaded the philosophies associated with that. Now, where the money was actually at is could you make it work on a per hectare basis? And so your returns were starting to be reflected on a per hectare basis.
Yeah, and I remember a real classic on farm. It was one of the first evaluations we did at Marshdale, and we've done a podcast on that previously, Alistair. But looking at remember growing hunter forage brassica out there and comparing a set stock system to a rotationary graze system, and suddenly learning that this wasn't actually a function of the animals, but actually a function of the
agronomy.
The agronomy and how much forage you grew. So it was we were starting to think about those farm system type discussions in that era as well.
Yeah, and so the new ownership was underway. It was actually quite well settled in at that stage.
It was settled in. The other aspect that I was involved in after the new ownership with the Wrightsons had the business in South America. So the PG Wrightson Seeds had a very South American focus, which I was the breeder in charge of the work in South America. And the New Zealand material had done so well in that environment, but it was a warmer environment. So it's actually quite a valuable addition to our portfolio because we can now breed under a hotter climate than New Zealand and bring material back to New Zealand, and that proved to be valuable.
Yeah, but some of your early products from the 90s and early 2000s were quite successful.
Yes, well, Horizon was quite stunning in Uruguay. It was 15% ahead of any other perennial in that environment.
And disease type.
Over I think 13 trials. It was quite amazing.
And that's a relatively early, by our current standards, a relatively early tetraploid perennial, almost hybrid type plant.
Prior to that, and now we've reselected an improvement on that Verazon. Yeah. Prior to that, they couldn't use perennial ryegrass in Uruguay. It's a tall fescue environment, tall fescue and annual ryegrass, really.
Yep, that's right. So no, that's cool. You enjoyed, and unless I'm mistaken, you really have an affinity for traveling to Uruguay and southern Brazil, and
yes.
No,
some real challenges breeding there, but it has a huge potential.
Yeah, absolutely. The seed production hub of South America, so there's a lot of opportunities sitting in those worlds, particularly for international opportunities. And I probably look at the end of the 210s and think, at the end of the day, we were getting some pretty harsh climatic swings in New Zealand. We'd just gone through a pretty big breakdown of our endophyte at the end of the 2000s in the Waikato, which is the upper North Island. We pretty much got too much of a wrong endophyte up there, and a black beetle cycle, which was on a 10-year cycle, turned up and made a real mess of the perennial pastures in the greater Waikato upper North Island. And the issue really then is sort of the global warming element had actually set in at about that stage. It started to have a really meaningful impact on the 210s, and we were seeing some quite harsh conditions being repeated in multiple years in a row and quite significant regional intensities. So I suppose that's where you just described Uruguay, other locations, some of the work we do in Australia, all of those are great test beds for our genetics that are created here, spread out to be validated elsewhere. Yeah. So the global approach to your breeding must have really taken off in the 210s.
Absolutely. That's my world has been probably only half New Zealand and half outside New Zealand since that period.
Yeah, which is quite a big deal because
there's a lot of breeding going on around the world.
Yeah, Southern Hemisphere focus because we're quite a unique latitude, and all of our countries are affected by oceanic.
Nearly all the Southern Hemisphere countries we're dealing with require winter growth. Yeah. They don't require winter hardiness. You get into the Northern Hemisphere countries where there's a good rainfall. They are normally relatively winter dormant, and it's about capturing the silage crops for the winter. So quite different farm systems. And of course, the moment we move into silage or anything to do with cutting, our costs go up. So the cheapest feed is always perennial grazing systems.
And I also think, and I think this has been proven out, that often the plants that you select for a grazing system are not the same plants that you would have selected for a silaging system.
Or to be fair, they can absolutely cross over, but you have quite extremes of each of those traits.
Yes, you do.
And so the reality is you are right in saying that, but there is a lot of intermediate types as well, and I suppose that's the
and we can cross traits in from one of those into our material quite easily. So we have a wider range of germplasm today to utilise as a basis.
Now, you've already mentioned something about the 210s that hold relevance to the New Zealand forage industry, is that we saw the giving up of our government plant breeding in the 2000s, and I believe I don't know when our joint ventures started, but particularly the GIL joint venture, but you've been a integral part of that evolution as well.
The Grasslands Innovation joint venture started after our merger with our PGG Wrightson Seeds in 2007-2008 area. And that's developed over the years, which we're still continuing with that joint venture.
Which is a funding opportunity to do pre-beat breeding and invest in those projects. But it did have an interaction, that joint venture had an interaction when the breeders were disestablished from ag research.
Yes, we employed those breeders to continue the work.
Yeah, which is a big deal. It's so good having those people on our teams. They offer so much. So that's the 210s. It actually finished pretty tough in New Zealand because we ended up with about 3 years of drought just through the end of the 210s. And so,
well, the other thing that happened at the end of the 210s, or 218, was the purchase of PGG Wrightson Seeds by DLF. So, so that became a huge change for us. Just as going from PGG to PGG Wrightson Seeds went from a regional to a national company, this time we went from a national company to a global company. Yeah. So the focus changed, and we're in transition towards completing that global
integration. Yeah, because that's right. Because literally for the majority of the 210s, we're a Southern Hemisphere
And this transition would have happened faster if it wasn't for COVID.
Yes, of course. Absolutely.
Everything would have happened faster.
Yeah, but again, we've already commented our industry is slow, and so here we are in 2025, and we're still we're releasing some really good structural systems as we speak, and we're seeing all that start to unfold as a global business. So hopefully we see some of that leadership lead to some great outcomes for New Zealand farmers.
Well, we now have access to international programs for finding traits to incorporate into our varieties, which is something we've really never had. Yeah. So it is a huge opportunity for us and for New Zealand farmers.
And I think if you think about the present day and some of the things, we've gone from I'm interested about the growth rate of my individual animals now through to I'm interested in what I'm doing from a farm systems point of view. I think currently we are still thinking about those farm systems, but obviously now we've got both hemispheres and a number of different farm systems there. I think we've seen the absolute rise of the consideration of environmental impact. So we're now thinking about emissions, for example, or the release of nutrients to waterways, and looking at how the forages can play a part in that, as well as being effective in terms of driving productivity. So we've got to this new era where we've got a few more things to consider than just the agronomics.
Oh, look, I think it's really cool to have that discussion because it reflects how that wasn't the priority decade. And as I say, each decade has seen those priorities change or new challenges. And the part that I always still struggle with is there are no fast answers to anything. And I look at that and think, we can all change, we can all adapt or adopt, but the reality is we can't ever do it as fast as everyone thinks. So, and you've been playing a long game, Alan. I've been playing a long game. This is a very long-term industry.
And I'm still doing some crosses that'll be, I'll have to stay for another 10 years.
Well, I may or may not be around to choose them. So that's the funny old part of that. It's like,
and of course, endophyte research takes a long time as well. And we have a wonderful joint venture with AgResearch scientists on that.
Yes.
It's really interesting to think of the role of endophyte and insect resistance in New Zealand. New Zealand is an island with a very limited range of predator insects. And when we get pest problems, we invariably get runaway numbers. The numbers of stem weevil per metre squared in New Zealand are phenomenal compared to an environment like South America where it evolved and it's under control or under reasonable control.
Yeah, so whole ecology is there.
The whole ecology of New Zealand is quite different from many other places in the world.
And I think the point, Alistair, you make this, that, our time frames are so different. You can imagine in a high-tech startup where I might be dealing with some software or a
AI-driven predictive outcome,
a bit of sort of electronic tech. Yeah. Every week I might have a different version, and I might get to version 25 and then release something which is only probably 2 years past when I first started. And you look at the same thing in a plant breeding sense.
You've only harvested it twice,
and so really, because you only get one crack a year. Yeah. And that these things are long term, you go 10 years. And I think that's why it's been particularly good going through the decades, because they are probably the smallest chunks of a plant breeding cycle that you can realistically look at practically. So it does really set it should set, and it doesn't always set the expectations around how quickly we might get some of this technology on farm.
Absolutely. And all due respect to just how that is like you look at science and literature, and there's been some pretty recent large-scale papers being released in New Zealand about pasture development and genetic gain and things like that. And you look at the literature as it stands as of today, published in 2020s, and not one thing that has been published in those papers was bred in the 2010s. They were all bred in the 2000s.
Well, you've got to understand that, of course, in plant breeding, the genetic gains are the enabler.
Yeah, correct.
The real yields out there and performance on farm is the management, the development of the farm system, and all the management aspects from grazing to fertilizer to whatever. Yeah. that is where the yield is captured.
But that's also why it's so complicated. And I've always felt it really hard for you guys compared to the maize people or even the alfalfa industries, is that they are very defined, singular harvest in the case of the grain industries and the maize industry. Alfalfa, very structured system, and even that's quite hard to find differences unless you've got perenniality differences. But in the New Zealand grazing pastoral system, where you maybe graze 30 times in 3 years, there's a lot of interactions that can occur in 30 grazing events or 25 grazing events, a lot of interactions. And so by the time you go unders and overs, pugging, fertilizer, no fertilizer, commodity changes and all these things, you see this undermining, but they are the empowerers of opportunities. And I think we've done the shoulders well. I think we've done the quality well. I think we've given the plants to create opportunity genuinely well, because sometimes people just don't look far enough back to see what it was like.
Well, we're also faced with the future.
Yes.
And the future will have climate warming involved and environmental aspects. The north of New Zealand will be the first to experience those changes.
And they have.
And we already see a much more difficult environment for perennials. And it's likely that hybrids will play a greater role in that environment as Kikuyu sneaks south.
Yeah, absolutely. And bugs, for that matter.
And the insects, yes.
And that's, to be honest, that's probably a lovely place to finish, to be fair, Alan, because you are right, is that in my eyes, pastoral breeding probably where the differences excel is when some things die and some things live. And what you've just described is a more variable future, and the differences that we'll probably see occur in the next 10 to 15, maybe 20 years in the New Zealand environment is more things will die, and therefore the things that live will become more valuable, and the genetic gain because of that will become more obvious. And so I feel that would be a nice place to sign off, because I see a future where all the work in resilience and endophyte and everything that we've been working towards is definitely going to pay off in this more variable and more intense environment.
Cool. Well, it's been that 50 minutes flew by. Absolutely.
Well, we'll be back. Don't you worry. There's more to talk about.
Thanks, Alan. That's been really fascinating. And I guess without trying to summarise everything, I think one of the key things I've learned is just the speed of change is so much slower in this industry than a lot of people give it credit for. I think there's been some really key, I think we've talked about some really key times or pinnacle moments in the breeding in New Zealand and elsewhere over the last few decades. And so that's been really, it's been really interesting. So thank you, Alan, and really appreciate it. This podcast is powered by Agricom. For more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep or visit agricom.co.nz.